This week on the Walk On podcast.
And as you mentioned, really thinking about the younger generations, the generations that are coming up, in many ways they're already expanding their circles of compassion. They're already bridging their silos. I mean, they are a real source of inspiration for me every single day.
Well, I was hanging around.
Hello and welcome to the Walk On podcast. This is season 2. We have had a great run of guests. Today is no different. I'm very excited to welcome our guests in a moment. But for those of you that are just joining us, maybe for the first time or a second listen, welcome back. And this podcast is really about a journey to find purpose, to living a life that is valuable and where you feel valued. I started this a couple of years ago, really trying to figure out what my next act is. And along the way, decided I really love talking to people. I really love finding out about why they do the things they do and how they're impacting the world. And so that's how we're here. Walk On comes from the song You'll Never Walk Alone, or from Walk On. Liverpool Football Club also used it, which is why I said You'll Never Walk Alone. But the lyrics are really great to me and important and impactful. And the gist of it is that no matter what you're going through, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And so just walk on, persevere, keep going, and good things happen at the end of the day. And so that's where we are. I am thrilled to welcome our guest today, Dr. Hope Ferdowsian, who is a practicing physician and a professor of medicine at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. She's president and co-founder of Phoenix Zones Initiative, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a good bit today. And as part of that, she's building an institute for universal rights, health, and justice, just a small little initiative there. And she's author of the books Phoenix Zones, Where Strength is Born and Resilience Lives. Welcome, Hope, to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. It's great to be with you.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. And why don't you tell our guests a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I'm a physician, and more specifically, I'm an internal medicine, preventive medicine, and global public health doc. Currently, I'm in New Mexico, where I've been for the past 8 or 9 years or so, living here with my partner and our senior dogs. And as you mentioned, I wear I wear a number of different hats, work hats, including in academic medicine, where I see patients and teach, and also as co-founder and president of a global nonprofit called Phoenix Zones Initiative.
You do wear a lot of hats, and I want to dig into them. Talk a little bit about that career arc. How do you find, what leads you to medicine, and then what leads you to these other initiatives? And while we're doing that, tell us a little bit more about, I know the book is a recap of really your exploits around the world and what you've encountered. So tell us a little bit about, how you arrived at medicine and then the work you're doing around the world.
Yeah, well, I started dreaming about a career in medicine, or what I thought medicine was, at a pretty early age. I grew up on a small farm in Oklahoma, and around the age of 9 resolved to be a doctor. And that was pretty soon after I learned about human rights violations. My parents were big readers and learners of the world, and my dad had immigrated to the U.S. from Iran in the 1960s. He came to the U.S. and met my mom. Not too soon after that, I was, I came into the world, and I learned about kids my age, even who were suffering around the world, suffering from persecution and hunger. And that really stuck with me and was, always kind of in my head, in my imagination. And like a lot of kids who grow up around animals, I also was sensitive to the suffering of animals as a kid. And by the time I was in medical school, I had already started to think about, the connections between human and animal suffering and how we treat people and animals. And fast forward to later in life, as a physician, I've gotten to do a lot of different things. I'm really grateful for those opportunities, and worked in public health. I've worked in human rights. I've worked in animal protection and a number of other different areas, and have gotten to work across the globe, across 6 continents, in the U.S. from East Coast to the West Coast and in between. And I've learned a lot from the patients I've taken care of, individuals who have experienced homelessness, and different types of violence. And at the same time, I've also had opportunities to work on policy to address and end human, animal, and environmental exploitation. And I have I've really gained a lot from that, and the people and organizations that I've worked with have been really incredible. But at times, I've felt in some ways like I'm traveling between different worlds, almost siloed worlds. And so over the
Mhm.
past, I'd say 10, 15 years, I've really become preoccupied with what we could do at the nexus of where the treatment of people, animals, and the planet meets. And that's what really brought me to write and publish Phoenix Zones, the book, and to co-found Phoenix Zones Initiative, the global nonprofit that I co-founded with my partner.
That Thank you for that. There is so much to unpack there. I mean, it's, several things jumped out at me. One of the things that I was literally thinking, you know, I have an internist and it's a very different experience than the work that you're doing, right? I mean, so how do you navigate those worlds and what drew you, you mentioned your 9-year-old self, but what drew you into policy and going and traveling the world and engaging in healthcare around the world instead of saying, I've got to practice and I love my patients and I'm changing their lives. But what made you take that additional worldview and that world action?
Yeah. So I think it was a few things. One is being exposed to those stories as a kid. I was really
Mhm.
curious about how my dad ended up, on a completely other side of the world. And, that really opened the door for me to be curious about the world. And, I grew up in rural Oklahoma, and that allowed my imagination to really grow and thrive. I would say the other thing kind of links me back to internal medicine. And internists love complexity, they thrive on complexity. And so, I was really interested in the complexity of the problems we face, whether it's, climate change and environmental degradation or disease risk, or violence and conflict. And I would say the third thing is, I'm also a preventive medicine doc, and I've always been interested in addressing the roots of problems, really understanding, how we can prevent bad things before they happen.
Yeah. And, unfortunately, American healthcare, I am not an expert in that space. I know enough to be dangerous, but, it is not traditionally getting to the root cause, right? It is people generally show up when they're sick. They generally show up to you when they're suffering from heart disease, and we're not looking at those earlier causes. How does that, how does that manifest itself with the work you're doing? What does that look like? So you've got office hours and you're teaching, and then you're taking projects and you're going and exploring a key issue around the world. Talk a little bit about how that comes together.
Uh, So I think in honesty, one informs the other. It has been really, even though it becomes a lot to juggle, and you kind of have to work through that and, make a good schedule and plan in advance and all of that. At the same time, the work that I do in clinic with patients really informs the policy work that I do, and the teaching work that I do informs the policy work I do, and vice versa. The policy work I do, really kind of understanding things like social, economic, and environmental determinants of health. That helps me better serve patients and better teach my medical students and residents as well about those issues, because you can really kind of marry the two in a lot of ways. So that, it, like I said, it becomes a fair amount to juggle, but a worthwhile
Mhm.
juggle.
For sure. Well, let's dig in a little bit. What are some of the issues that you've really been focused on right now in your work?
So at Phoenix Zones Initiative, our goal is really to lend our medical and public health expertise. We focus on education and outreach there with the public, and also professionals and students in fields like medicine, public health, the sciences, law. And then also research and innovation, identifying holistic solutions to big problems, whether those are related to climate change and its health effects or disease risk, communicable disease and non-communicable disease, or violence and conflict. And then finally, we engage in a fair amount of leadership and advocacy. And so we co-founded Phoenix Zones Initiative in 2019. We've been around for a little over 5 years, but we've been able to do quite a bit. We've, in many ways become an international voice for people, animals, and the planet. We've helped others find their voice and do the same. And, we've been able to change policy and practice from Washington, D.C. to the United Nations. And so, we feel really privileged to be able to do that work. And as you mentioned, one of our latest initiatives is an Institute for Universal Rights, Health, and Justice, which we're really, really excited about building.
Yeah, let's dig in there because listeners will know that creating the next generation of leaders and empowering people is a passion of mine. Talk a little bit more about that work and how do you see this empowering the next generation of leaders?
So, our interest in building the Institute really grew out of our broader mission at Phoenix Zones Initiative, which is to advance justice for all so people, animals, and the planet can thrive. And our goal with the Institute is to help build, and support a workforce that's really equipped to advance rights, health, and justice with the moral consistency that's required and in thinking about our more than human world. And what we hope to do is really center the Institute on a consistent commitment to justice and the nexus between human, animal, and planetary health and well-being. And we feel that that sort of approach is really necessary given the scope of the problems that we're dealing with today, whether those are environmental problems, health problems, or other interlinked issues that we've spoken about. And we want to empower the next generation of leaders to tackle those issues in really holistic and meaningful and impactful, effective ways. And we want to do that through classes, workshops, conferences, through leadership training and fellowships, and then also through digital and maybe some print publications as well. But really, we want to create a home where individuals can converge, students, scholars, practitioners converge and, really kind of sort through the historical context for these issues, shared ideas, exchange ideas, and then also to think about solutions that can be workshopped and implemented. And maybe those are some that some people are already doing and can share with others, and maybe, others are interested in picking up solutions for the communities in which they work. This is building on a lot of the work that we already do through Phoenix Zones Initiative, but really kind of taking it to the next scale. And as you mentioned, really thinking about the younger generations, the generations that are coming up, in many ways they're already expanding their circles of compassion. They're already
Yeah.
bridging their silos. I mean, they are a real source of inspiration for me every single day.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm really struck by we live in a complex world. No issue that you pull out, it's just pulling threads of sweaters, right? And there's no issue that you pull on that you're not going to pull that and all of a sudden there's this, miles of yarn there, right? So I love people that are trying to take big holistic swings. Why don't we, if we can, I know you write about this in your book, Phoenix Zones, where strength is born and resilience lives. Could you talk about maybe, an example from the book of something you've been tackling and what a holistic approach looks like?
Absolutely. So, over the course of my career, I've worked in some really difficult places. Not difficult for me, but difficult for the individuals who are living there. And over the course of that time, I've realized how not just how much suffering there is, but also how resilient individuals can be if they're given the chance. And after living through some of the most unimaginable things. And they haven't done it alone. They've done it through the help of, what others have referred to as upstanders. I love that word instead of bystanders, individuals who really choose to get involved, and they create safe spaces for these, for survivors. And they do that through what we refer to as Phoenix zones, healthy environments that are really bound by key principles like respect for freedom and love and justice, and this idea that we all have dignity, we all have intrinsic value, we all have potential if we're given the opportunity. And so I've seen that time and time again. And that's really what I wanted to write about in Phoenix Zones is what can we learn there from, survivors and those who've helped them to create other Phoenix Zones, spaces where individuals can kind of rise and thrive like the proverbial phoenix who rises from the ashes. And there's one story that I talk about in the book that really drives home the thesis of the book, and that's about a sanctuary in Southern California that serves combat veterans and rescued wolves and wolf dogs. And you really see these principles in action, and you especially see compassion even across species. And over time, what I came to learn and getting to know the folks there and the wolves and wolf dogs that they're serving, some of the veterans have come back from war, years of war, and they haven't been able to find anything that really helps them recover from post-traumatic stress disorder, from addiction, from depression, even suicidality. And they've found purpose at the sanctuary, working at the sanctuary, and they've also found solidarity and solace and peace with the wolves and wolf dogs that they're working with. And at the same time, you also see how the wolves and wolf dogs are recovering, not just from like the chains that have been on their necks or the limp that they've developed because of confinement, but also they're recovering from their psychological wounds. And you see this building of trust, and so in a lot of ways, there's so many lessons there for the rest of us. And so we've tried to put that into practice with the community-based interventions that we've, engaged in with our partners and, with the more global policy areas of focus that we have as well.
Yeah. I have a background in civic engagement and wrote a book on the topic. And there are a couple veterans groups that you talk about purpose and veterans in particular. And there are a couple veterans groups that have gone to work by putting veterans to work, bringing teams together to do cleanups and recovery during natural disasters. And it is that sense of purpose. You use the word, and that is that interconnectivity as well. And I love the work you're doing, bringing animals into that and the role they play and the role we play in their lives. And it really is powerful, powerful work. And you see it every day. How, we could go deeper into that and I, being thoughtful of time and the length of this podcast, you want to switch for a second and go to, as you think about creating these Phoenix zones, right? There is a lot of heartbreak in the world. There is a lot of challenges that you are trying to overcome. And these are not, they're fairly intractable or seemingly fairly intractable problems. I went to Haiti a few years ago with an organization called Harvest 107. It's a great organization. A teenager decided they wanted to feed the world and started this nonprofit. And so I went and served for a week there. And I felt so like I was doing my small part. And I felt I took away so much of that. But then you leave and you're like, there's just so much that they have to overcome. So my long-winded preamble is, and I know your name's Hope, but how do you retain that optimism and that willingness to look at those veterans issues? And now we're going to look at, refugee issues. And how do you get up every day and go back to that work without being overwhelmed with the sense of enormity of these challenges?
So it's such a great question because I think those of us who are really interested in affecting positive change in the world struggle with this on a daily basis. And I think, we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't say it's hard, it's difficult at times. But
Yeah.
I really gain a lot of my own resilience vicariously through others. And in witnessing the resilience of those individuals who have overcome adversity that I wouldn't have even begun to imagine before they told me
Yeah.
their stories has we talk about vicarious trauma, right? In terms of and that
Mhm.
influences compassion fatigue that physicians and other people experience. But there's also this
Yeah.
concept that I think doesn't get enough attention of vicarious resilience, this idea that we can learn how to be resilient from others. We can glean some of that resilience from others. And so, I think that's why it's so important for us to also in kind of shifting the narrative to not only speak of suffering, but also
Mhm.
tell stories of resilience, of recovery,
Yeah.
of the possibilities that everyone deserves. And so I would say, that really keeps me going. And in addition to, making sure that I'm living in healthy ways and
Yeah.
surrounded by others
Yeah.
who, bring tons of love into my life and working with other colleagues who are similarly committed. I think all of those things are hugely important to waking up every day and to, maintaining that sense of purpose and the sense of hope that you can move forward and make a difference.
I, thank you for that. I love the perspective that you shared that really it had not resonated with me. But so often when we think of, we'll use the Haiti example, or, we have politicians who write off people or places because they aren't living the life that we are. Or, yeah, you know what? We can't solve that problem. Just why, it's not a good use of limited resources, right? But what you're saying is these Phoenix zones are beacons of hope and opportunity. And if we just take a minute to really look what's happening there, that recovery and growth is possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think, we can't get caught up in this anxiety of, you know, what's impossible, right? We have to get
Yeah.
caught up in the optimism of what's possible.
And how does that resonate? I'm jumping around all a bit. This is such a great conversation. Thank you. How do
Thank you.
policymakers, particularly the US policymakers you interact with, they like clean, simple, right? Government unfortunately is more often than not a blunt hammer, not a scalpel. And that's by design in some ways. It's just also, you can't solve in one sitting. So what is their response when you start talking about these problems and you're asking for policy change or funding? You know, do they get this opportunity, or is there a lot of convincing that you have to really point to it's feasible and
I think
morally responsible, right? Because that's the other thing you're talking about is
right.
values driven work.
Right, right, exactly. So I think increasingly politicians, policymakers are getting the connections, even between people, animals, and the planet, and how rights, health, and justice are connected. And, I think, in thinking about policy, we have to be practical. We have to think about, okay, what could we do here that doesn't compromise values and inserts those values in a piece of legislation or policy and, work towards something bigger later. So, we do a fair amount of that in thinking about the local and international changes that we can make, but always starting from that place of principles and values, I think is so key.
Yeah. Yeah, that can get beyond partisanship and, political calculation when you start talking about the role of human beings helping humans and animals and our planet, kind of cutting beyond that. Well, I want to be thoughtful of our time. I have a question I want to ask towards the end, but what's next for you and the Institute and your work? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, well, we're really focused on this next stage of Phoenix Zones initiative, including building the institute. What we really want to do is create space for these, younger folks, kind of students, early career folks who, are making their own way in the world to tackle big problems that are of great importance. And so that's what we're primarily focused on, just kind of paying it forward, if you will.
Well, and not to try and put a PR bow on it since I'm a public relations guy, but you are trying to create your own Phoenix zone and building the next generation of people and showing them with what they want to do, what's possible and how to do it.
Yeah. And they are so thirsty and hungry, for that sort of support. So it's great to be there to offer them that support.
It really is fascinating when you think culturally and socially where we are. I mean, I'm Generation X and we're just cranky, old people. But this truly is an empathetic generation coming to the fore and sometimes maybe too feeling that they really carry it. But it is a group that whether it's politics or community engagement or the work that you're doing, there does seem to be a willing audience for going into that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I'm Gen X too, but I think, we see
Yeah.
that those younger folks are also, inspiring, those of us
Yeah.
in older generations as well.
Yeah.
And so I think, you
Yeah.
pointed to their level of sensitivity. I think it's, a question of how can they take that empathy and really harness it in a way that is, that is effective for the issues
Yes.
that they want to address.
Yeah. It's so fantastic. Two last questions. We'll do the bigger one first. So I loved at the very beginning that you said your 9-year-old self looked at the world around you and knew you wanted to be a doctor and you knew you wanted to be changed. Boy, I wanted to be a hockey player. So I think we're on different planes that's fantastic. But what would 9-year-old Hope think about Dr. Ferdowsian and what she's doing today?
Oh, goodness. That's a difficult question. I think,
Yeah.
I think I still have that 9-year-old in me, as most of us do.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, as a kid, you also think about, go out, don't be afraid. And
Mhm.
I think she would tell me, keep going, don't be afraid. All those, obstacles that feel like they're obstacles, they aren't. Keep going, dream like you did when you were a 9-year-old. I think that's probably what she would tell me.
I think that's amazing. And honestly, those are lyrics in Walk On. It is, so it's really powerful. And I'm a music person and the way music can capture emotions and direction. And you just said it beautifully. So thank you. And last question here, yours was sort of found at a young age, but what would you advise, whether it's the people going through your institute or, an adult who's looking at a new career trajectory? How would you encourage them or advice for others trying to find their passion, their purpose?
Yeah. So I think, think about what you would do if you weren't paid to do it. If
Yeah.
this were your last day on Earth over and over and over again, kind of like a Groundhog Day of your last day here. And what's really meaningful, what feels like it's not work, and allows you
Yeah.
to engage in it in a really wholehearted way that makes a difference. That's what I think I'd say.
I love it. Find that thing that is all encompassing of you and motivates and moves you. I love that. It's fantastic. Well, before we go, where can folks find out about the Institute and your book?
Yeah, so you can go to phoenixzonesinitiative.org for our organization's website, has information about the Institute as well. And phoenixzones.com will take you to the book.
Well, this was truly an honor and a privilege, and I'm thrilled that you were on today and look forward to continuing to watch the work that you do. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been such a joy.
Yes, and we're going to sign off here. This is the Walk On podcast, people leading with passion and purpose, providing us a roadmap for your personal journey. Hear their stories, find your passion, walk on. Again, Dr. Ferdowsian, thank you.
Thank you.
Next up on the Walk On podcast.
I thought, 36, I was a CMO. It was my dream. It was my passion. And all of a sudden I got there, and it was one of these moments in life where I said, this is always what I wanted to be when I grow up. And now that I'm here, I'm not sure that this is it.
Well, I was hanging around when you noticed me looking at you. Well, I've been staring for hours, thinking about exactly what to do to you. I can't believe you didn't notice the 1,000 times I walked